like how often? That's just like a bug, basically, right? So
Sure. Sure. I mean, you're correct. It is a bug. I think that has been addressed in this patch, but it's still extremely creative and cool to leverage that. Like,
wait, can I clarify right there then? Can I just
sure.
take that as a piece? So you said it's cool to leverage a bug, and it's cool if I do that in the future,
No,
right?
Jung, no.
In
It's all
some
good, right?
contexts, this is an extremely blurry, subjective line. So like there.
Now, Spawn, if you guys don't know who that is, this guy is Team Liquid's head coach for League of Legends. He is one of the most well-regarded coaches in League. This guy is really known to care about his players. A great coach, a great dad, a great competitor, a really bad PoE player. But one of the people that I've met that I respect the most. So yeah, this is Spawn. Welcome to the Hour Pod. Oh, I guess we'll talk about the title after. What's up, Jake?
Thank you so much for having me. When you said you were going to introduce me and I had to introduce you, I was a little bit nervous that it was going to be too serious. But thank you. Good introduction. Um, I am Spawn. As John said, I'm pretty excited about this podcast. I think that we've been talking about doing something like this for a little while. I'm going to bring probably more of a casual perspective to the to the PoE side. But obviously used to work at Riot as well, so I have a lot of perspective about games from publisher side and from a coaching side. So should be a good conversation. Jezzy NA was a former top laner of Complexity Red who played with legendary players such as NK Inc. in his League of Legends career before failing and swapping to Path of Exile, and is one of the more alternative build guides out there. If you want to build that you need to press multiple buttons and have significant understanding of how layered offense works, Jung is the person for you. And there is a good chance that a lot of the builds that you need pretty much a PhD in Path of Exile to study won't actually make it to release, as he will get them nerfed significantly before they even get there. But in all seriousness, I think Jung is one of the people that actually fundamentally understands the game of Path of Exile and can explain it pretty well to his viewers. And I think that allows him to build, build guides that probably a lot of other people don't build. And I really like and appreciate the complexity. I've played a couple of these builds myself. I played his Eye of Winter Arcanist brand. I played his old school Blade Trap with Fatal Flourish. So I think that this should be a fun conversation because I do have some of that. And on the other end, hopefully you can bring some good technical knowledge about the game as well.
Formerly described as the bedrock of PoE1 by Octavian, and similarly described by secret well-respected informants as the GOAT, my GOAT, and base savior, responsible for a lot of the major work on Path of Exile 1 these days. This is Andrew. It's someone I would love to hear more about, more gloat and glaze, a little bit behind the scenes, but can't wait for the future. And our second guest today is Chris Octavian, renowned amateur League of Legends caster from the time when I was playing amateur League of Legends too. You could call us actually both former amateur content creators. On the reel, I've watched a ton of your casting reel from back in the day when I used to scout for NACS, and he's actually one of the most underrated PoE build makers back in the day. I've stolen your Rainbow Trapper as inspiration for 2 races actually in the late 3.1s. Remade that on a quiz, saw the old Krima Necro stuff that I really liked back in the day too. I know Rise was part of that as well, but really underrated from back in the day, and can't wait to be talking to you here today. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, that's a deep cut, man.
I mean, the content, it was actually a smaller world than I remember back then too, but maybe we can get into that a little bit. There's some cross-cutting stuff, as you know, Spawn's a caster these days, or it was.
I'm not a caster these days. I was a caster 7 years ago. So
it's like these days, yeah. Man. So our podcast is called Take the Bait. A lot of our questions we've talked briefly about what we might want to cover, but at the same time I want to kind of start with something that you guys can choose to engage with or not. I think it's just something I've been curious about. You guys both work mostly on the PoE1 game, right? Almost exclusively?
At this point, yeah, we're exclusively on PoE1. I mean, both of us have jumped between the 2 games over the years we've been here at the company, but yeah, as of the last few expansions, I've been only on PoE1. I think Andrew has too.
Yeah, I think generally maybe from like that period of like 2020 up until like 2024ish, I would have said I was exclusively on PoE1, and then in the lead up to like 010 and PoE2's release, I was flicking back and forth a bit. But I'd say now I'm back on PoE1 solely.
Amazing. So then do you guys think that PoE1 is the best ARPG on the market right now because you guys work on PoE1, or do you guys work on PoE1 because it's the best ARPG on the market right now?
Well, I don't really think of ARPGs as like best and worst. I play all of them generally, except strangely I've never played Diablo 2, but I plan to
Whoa!
play it at some point. I'd say my favorite historically might have even been Grim Dawn or over Path of Exile 1, but it's pretty close between those two.
See, I'm a far less educated gamer when it comes to this department. I'm very much a very singular kind of person. Like I have an obsession and I focus on that to probably the detriment of a lot of other things. So like I've really not played very many other ARPGs. Like when I go to play a video game, it's usually Path of Exile or like one or two other games. I just don't have a lot of breadth when it comes to that.
I'm actually the same as you. Like I've had very limited ARPG experience outside, and I think like actually over the past couple of years, seeing a lot of the convergence and cross cutting from the two PoE games has been unreal now. And like it's like once upon a time when they said like, yo, the benefits, you're gonna see them in PoE1, and we're gonna see like the iterations between both. I really like didn't believe that, but it's so much more present now.
Well, that's sort of the nice thing of having the two games now is like both games can just steal the best parts from each other. And it's like you don't have to use them in the exact same way because they are different games, but it's like, have we talked about the volatile Varlord? Would you be okay if you want to explain it, or
Whatever
is
you
that
want to
spoiler?
talk about. Go ahead.
Oh well, you know how in PoE 2 you have the corruption outcome where it divines the ranges of unique items outside of their normal ranges. I think there's a Mirage currency that's going to be doing that, which we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah, I actually
Bruh.
don't. So another designer was the one who designed all of the like specific reward outcomes for various mechanics and mirages. So I don't actually remember off the top of my head exactly where it comes from, but it does come from Mirage.
Okay, so how much of those mechanics are like, hey, this cool thing exists in 2, I want to bring it to 1, versus, hey, let's design something that's going to go into both games simultaneously?
Rarely is something designed with the intention that it cross pollinates into both games. I say rarely, like I can't think of an example. Often it's, this is a cool thing that has been in one of the games or the other and has been, has shown through battle testing, so to speak, that it's something either players like or we like, or hopefully both. And why not adapt it? If it's a good idea and we can adapt it to one game or the other, working around however that game, the constraints, so to speak, of whichever game, then wouldn't you want to do that?
Yeah, for sure. And do you guys like feel like the selfish plagiarism in that sense then like exists in like across other games as well? Like Andrew, like how often are you picking up like a different ARPG and thinking like, hey, I need to figure out a way to do this in PoE1, and then like hopefully therefore it's like going across like multiple teams? Or is it something where you guys try and stay internally with that? Like how does the actual design philosophy work with kind of how you look at mechanics in that way?
I mean, there's definitely conscious decisions to not straight up just like plagiarize something from another game for sure. I guess most of the things you'd pick up might actually be like you'd unconsciously gather like certain cool aspects from other games. Like a funny story actually is like we started developing all these holy skills like right at the very start of this league cycle. So Chris was coming up with all these cool holy skill ideas, and then I think it was a few weeks later, Diablo 4 announced Paladin. So we were like all worried. It's like, oh, hopefully they don't think that because Diablo 4 dropped Paladin that we're just like straight up copying them.
You should have copied the Paladin monetization strat too. Super smart.
See, this is where my lack of knowledge of other ARPGs gets in the way because I have no idea what they did for that. But yeah, even like the fact that Holy Hammers is called Holy Hammers, apparently there is a skill in Diablo that has a similar name, and I got some feedback internally that like maybe we should change the name because players will expect it to behave a certain way that it doesn't. But I don't know. Holy Hammers is a cool name. I like alliteration.
That's okay, yeah. Because when Spectral Helix came out, that was sort of I remember thinking at the time like that was the thing that's most related. And we were really excited about Helix, but obviously it's gone through its sagas as a skill. Actually, it was kind of really dominant for a while, right? I think we had that as the premier like skill for a while, and I think I'm gonna use that to segue into what I really am interested in, which is balance, because I think that kind of set melee weapon balance back for a long time. For about like a year, Helix was the skill. Damage numbers weren't there for anything else. And I guess the thing that I've always been thinking about is PvE game balance is really weird, right? In a sense of you're not actually balancing for like play rate against other players or win rate against other players. And I've always been curious kind of what the core priorities you're thinking about are. There's a lot more specifics, but how do you guys see that kind of concept in your context, in your domain?
I think the goal isn't necessarily to get everything perfectly balanced, just because of how ever-changing our game is. I feel like it's a little bit of a futile task, and we don't really have the time resource to develop to get that into like a perfect spot every time. But what you'd prefer to have is really, well, me personally, I just like a variety. I don't want the same skill to be running the meta for like 2 years or whatever, like historically. I mean, to be fair, we probably have had some skills that have been on top for quite a while now, and maybe we should more radically shift them out. But
I think like I want to hear first, I think, because I think as you're talking, it doesn't need to be a clear answers, but getting the direction of where you guys are at is the most interesting for me to start this. I think, yeah, like how you guys individually feel about it.
One of the important things as well is, you know, you're correct that it's not a PvP game. So like if skill A is strong, it doesn't make, you know, a player's experience worse who isn't playing that necessarily because they're not playing against skill A. But it still does in a way if something is like, you know, the whole premise of a game like Path of Exile is here. We have this really big puzzle. Come and solve it. You know, we have all of these moving pieces, all these uniques and ascendancies and skills and supports and whatever. Come and solve this or solve some little corner of it. And if there's a skill that just does a bajillion damage out the box with basically no effort, it's not a very interesting puzzle anymore, is it? So like that is part of it. Like there needs to be some, you know, balance needs to be in place so that it isn't just like I slot this skill in and win without any extra effort, which, you know, you can have your own subjective opinion on how well of a job we've done on that historically. And then you also don't want players feeling like, you know, there are a lot of choices that are basically pointless because this thing over here does everything better than every other choice. So like those are probably the two driving reasons why balance is important, even in a game that isn't PvP centric.
Or is there a reason why it's a bit more conservative these days as far as changing goes? Because I understand the resource side, but let's say that the concerns then that you're bringing up right now are things like a really stale meta where things are like constantly the same, and then having like false heterogeneity, or false choice, like an illusion of choice, where you could pick all these skills, but like, you know, lightning strike is better than the rest. Not anymore, but hypothetically, right? What's sort of the hesitation these days? Because I remember we used to have those massive balance patches. We'd see like 20 on the low end or like a couple hundred skills just have their numbers changed. Is that a matter of resources these days still? Is that just about care? Is that like, what are the drivers behind not doing that these days?
I don't know. I guess it just hasn't been brought up very much. Like, I think there have been times in the past where the higher ups are like, don't shake the boat too much, because if people don't have their like tried and true safe skill, then they'll be more reticent to play the next league. So like from a personal point of view, I'd love if everything just got scrambled without even like a huge amount of thought going into like what goes up and what goes down. But going back to your like whole heterogeneity comment, that is one of the other axes of balance that we can address. Like if all the skills scale exactly the same, like a lot of the spells scale in the same way and a lot of the attacks scale in the exact same way. So if one of them is 10% better than all those others, then why would you play any of the other ones? So you need to kind of like try to differentiate all the skills as well in terms of like their damage shapes and their clear speed and their single target potential and their scaling axes.
So I have a question. I want to jump in here a little bit. Andrew, I don't know if you've played League of Legends, but Jung, Octavian, and I obviously have.
Strangely, I've never tried it.
Okay, cool. So then you're going to absolutely miss this one. But in League of Legends, when they balance, they like take an average player, like a gold player, and then they balance around that. But if there's outliers, say, you know, a champion is fine in gold, but then has like 100% pick rate in pro, then they'll obviously slap it down and be like, well, we don't want to see the exact same thing played in every single pro game. I was wondering if you guys could speak a little bit about what areas you look at when you're looking to balance skills. Is because like I was talking to Jung about this. Like you're not balancing for Jung. He's playing like 20 hours a day on League Start. Are you balancing around someone that plays 5 hours a day and the journey that they have through Path of Exile, League Start? How do you look at that? And then I think that a lot of people talk about skills in terms of how League Start actually works around the abilities, but what other levers do you look at as the journey of the league happens? Because sometimes we're very slow to actually pick up which skills are good and bad as they're introduced into the game, in my opinion.
I feel like that's more of like a global question that goes across many, many leagues rather than on a per league basis, because the game's been out for so long now that we've kind of ended up in this steady state equilibrium where this is how things are and this is the difficulty of the game. And every so often we might shake that up with like making Act 1 extremely hard at some point in time and not doing it to the other acts. But yeah, I'm not really sure. Do you have anything on that?
I mean, on a specific skill by skill basis, usually my playtesting will consist of like, how does this skill feel immediately when I get it? And for, maybe a few dozen levels thereafter. How does it feel in early maps? How does it feel in like yellow maps? How does it feel in like red maps? And usually when I'm doing those tests, it's like Alk, enter map, do some combat, fight a boss, So yeah, I'm not necessarily doing. I mean, we do have a QA department that also will test, and the QA department actually skews mostly, in my experience, towards testing things in their end game and like giga juiced and super entrenched established player sort of context, because usually when we're hiring for QA, that is the kind of person that we hire. We're hiring people with thousands and thousands and thousands of hours in the game. So often what actually gets overlooked in testing is that stuff that I try and test while I'm, doing the major tweaks in the implementation to the skill, is the experience of it when you first get it, and the experience of it in like, on a crappy character who's just hit maps. Because, and that's not to say that we always get that perfectly right. There are skills that I have implemented that I would like to go back and try and improve that specific experience on. But that is, the first impression, and that is quite important for sure.
So then you guys are speaking from almost like a vacuum, not in a bad way, but from like your guys' perspective. There aren't like kind of key vignettes of like player vignettes or like player archetypes that you'd be thinking about, like, oh, we need to think about like Joe Blow who enters maps at like 20 hours. Like this guy is going to be weaker in this kind of way. Does that sort of like, is there a kind of average player or like medium player that you're thinking about when you do like balancing changes? Or is it just about like this skill compared to other skills? Or is it the tools in the system compared to other tools in the system?
I'd say it's more on the skill compared to other skills and this tool compared to other tools. It's like I said, we're at this like sort of equilibrium state with the game where if we're thinking about the average player just getting into the maps, we're probably thinking on more of a global level. Like for example, in Settlers League, when we like decided to buff basically all the melee skills scaling massively. So that's a thing of like, okay, melee players aren't having a good experience. Players typically think that melee is behind other archetypes. So let's bring melee up everywhere. Rather than on a per skill basis, to me, it's more like this skill is relatively worse than another, or this skill is relatively better than another, and we should bring them more closely in line, while also trying to differentiate them in like ways that aren't just damage.
So like in terms of that, then I think like yeah, we've kind of ended up in a really skill centric place, but are there other levers that you guys are more comfortable pulling in terms of rebalancing? Because I know like the passive tree, for instance, is fairly static as far as things go, but we've seen some pretty big shifts in terms of, say, like gearing wise, right? Like the gear meta has changed drastically in the past 2 years, where an energy blade stack or an energy shield stacker used to be really weak, and probably for the past year now it's been very, very dominant in both like racing starts and hardcore and whatnot. So like what levers would you actually look to other than skill gems when it comes to rebalancing PvE?
Our head of QA likes to say that everything is always more complicated than you think it is, and he's absolutely correct there. And it's one of the reasons why the past few leagues, I would say, we haven't seen huge shakeups in those large systems, because you can't really adjust a large system like that in isolation. If we were to go in and make a lot of changes to the passive tree, it would probably have knock-on effects to some uniques and some ascendancies and some skills and X, Y, and Z. And that isn't a reason not to do it. I would love to do all of these things, but yeah, it's tackling any of those larger systems is often going to be like one of the focal points of a league's of an expansion, if that makes sense. Like, and that's often how we think about it. A given expansion is like there's we want to get X number of focal points and then a lot of miscellaneous extra stuff alongside it. For Mirage, for instance, it was the endgame rework, the League itself. Probably something that I'm forgetting going off the top of my head.
Yeah. That's not to say we haven't done many recently. Like, for example, you're probably going to notice you're finding a lot more currency this league.
True.
You might be slamming exalts on like crappy gear that you probably weren't slamming exalts on before. And I think in like a few of the previous leagues, there might be like subtle things that have vastly affected your campaign itemization, like the Gambler, for example, being in every town.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Part of what you just said was like really cool, Octavian, because I think that people, now that there is just like the PoE1 team, are very interested in like kind of how you guys view your backlog, and like if there are any things in that list that you are like, we didn't get to it this league, but like I really want to get to it. And then from someone that used to work at Riot, I'm really interested like how much of it is a push system onto people working on stuff versus how much of it is a pull system of, hey, we have this like backlog. And Andrew, I'm really like, I love skill gems. Like I want to jump in, like grab like 40 of these things and change them before the new patch. Like, you guys talk about like your workflow going into like how new leagues kick off and kind of what it looks like?
Yeah, I mean, usually it'll be around this time, actually. The release of an expansion, we'll be talking about the next one. And it'll be like trying to work out, those large points first. Because, yeah, we have a backlog of like, like I said, we have like 3 or 4 focal points to every expansion. We have a backlog of probably like 20 focal points worth of stuff that we want to do. And you can only fit 3 or 4 into a given 4-month dev cycle. And then usually within the course of that 4-month dev cycle, you get to the end and you realize, oh, there's this thing that would have been really cool and we could fit that in maybe next time. And it's like that cartoon meme of the guy who's trying to fit something into his daily schedule and he's pulling sleep out in order to do it. And yeah, we have internally we have an issue tracking system that has a backlog of a ton of these things, but often the issue tracking system is more for like the hyper specific stuff, and for the broader scope related things that's done more like just in conversations between designers and tracked in like internal documents.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of like cost benefit analysis that goes into like what type of things we touch as well. Like, for example, next league, I'm not saying we're definitely not doing this, but next league we could say, okay, we want to rework mana costs throughout the game. And it's like, if you look hard at anything, you're going to find innumerate problems. But the thing is this a worthwhile goal? It's like, yes, okay, so Melee has this issue where mana eventually devolves into everyone using mana leech or minus mana cost on their rings. And it's like, should mana matter that much to Melee builds? Should it matter as much as it currently is for spells? Like, do they scale mana cost correctly? Are there any builds that are like particularly mana intensive? But that to fully audit mana is going to take a ton of our time, and then we might come out of it ending up making a bunch of changes which make people unhappy. So touching mana in that way is probably not going to be on our agenda. Well, maybe it will be at some point, but definitely not in the near future.
It's one of the things that Mark was talking about in the Q&A where like it's really easy to be scared of touching some of these systems, be scared of touching, for instance, the endgame changes that we did this league, because there's an established status quo that is pretty good, but like it could probably be better in a lot of cases. And you could just keep iterating on existing systems and basically continue to put icing on the cake, so to speak. But sometimes you have to go and bake another cake. And that's much, much harder.
Yeah, I think like in terms of the systems side, the thing that stood out to me most this patch, I think the intelligence nerf was the single, from my perspective, best balance line I've ever seen in a patch note. And that was
the interesting thing about that is it was one of our QA who brought it up, but we were just looking at the relative ratio of the attributes compared to the bonuses they give and comparing that to the small node values on the passive tree. And all of them were basically correct, except the amount of energy shield you get from intelligence. Like, for example, I think on the passive tree, a small evasion node would grant you like 14% increased evasion, while a small energy shield node would be like 6 or 7%. So the fact that dexterity and intelligence were giving the same amount of percent evasion and energy shield was just wrong, and I guess that's just been wrong forever. Not to say everything needs to be perfectly symmetrical, but yeah, it was definitely justification for the nerf outside of it just being historically very good for a while.
Okay, that's more like simplified then. So when it comes to like bigger like when you're talking, I'm thinking about Expedition right now, as a patch, because I totally agree. I think the public perception to system-wide changes can be skewed very, very negative. And I was on that side for like probably a year and a half, where like 3.15 was like doomsday for me. Um, I probably wasn't as vocal at back then, but like I remember thinking, "Oh my god, I'll never be able to go through a map again or go through the campaign." I remember walking to Blood Aqueducts in a race, getting frozen, and not pressing my flask and dying and thinking this game is doomed. But on retrospect, I think it's, and this might be unpopular, one of the like most important balance patches that ever happened. So, is it a matter of building up like equity or trust, or like, and then also on the flip side, how do you see that patch? Like, how do you see a patch like Expedition in the grand scheme?
Well, I think there's things in the Expedition patch that I very strongly agree with, and then there's a bunch of mistakes we made on the patch which I think sold it more than it needed to be sold. So, for example, the damage support nerfs are like, I was very happy with those changes because the damage supports at that time were just like 50% more damage on average for a damage support, and that basically invalidated a lot of the more interesting supports in the game. But the things that were definitely an issue with that patch were the mana cost multipliers being changed on supports. I think the numbers were ran, and it's like certain melee builds, just if you were using those same supports, it doubled your mana cost, which is definitely not acceptable. And then there was also, I think there was some problems with the flask changes, but I can't actually remember the specifics of those now. But yeah, I think Expedition certainly burnt us a little bit in the sense of like going and doing a full nerf patch. I don't know if we've done a patch since then on that scale in terms of like character power nerf.
The one that I would be thinking about is not so much like system wide, but casters took a pretty big hit, I would say, especially in early game during the Divine Blessing change. That one was like really big. And then the changes to inspiration, going from additive to multiplicative, were really big for like casters across the board. I think that's probably responsible for a lot of like why there's a dearth of casters right now in like the early game. Can't think of anything else though.
Yeah, those two changes don't really come to mind. I'm thinking more of like a wide scale system change that just makes everyone weaker. But yeah, I can't really think of anything since Expedition. But there certainly would have been nerfs were done.
Well, like I guess for me, like that kind of was like like pretty large scale. I mean, I guess there were casters using mana, and there was Archmage, and there was the buffs there. But for like a long time, I think EB and like EBMLM specifically, those two things were really dominant of like at least the league start caster meta. And maybe I'm wrong there. Let me just ramble here instead, or go completely differently. How wrong do you think I am, or maybe more broadly, how dumb do you think the average like content creator, build maker, streamer is in terms of actually identifying what's strong and what isn't?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on this because Jung told me yesterday that he thinks that PoE content creators are now too good. They've got the game figured out. And I was like, I am really curious to see whether the developers actually think you guys are good at figuring out their game, because I don't know whether that's true. Like, I think that every now and again, like, people completely whiff on what is actually strong in the current meta, and then you find it like 6 months later.
Well, this is just anecdotal because I played Kinetic Fusillade last league, right? Mm-hmm. I leveled it throughout the game and it was super duper smooth, and I played it all through endgame. And then usually what I do is I farm up a ton of currency and I'm like, okay, what am I going to invest my next build into? So I actually go on my local dev client and try out a ton of people's builds, like build creators ones that I see on Ninja. And it's like Kinetic Blast just didn't do it for me. Fusillade's just better. So people, even though Kinetic Blast was the more popular skill last league, I guess people didn't pick up on Fusillade so quickly, but it does seem to be pretty popular now.
Mm-hmm. I guess the other side of that coin, though, is like people will come up with builds that we just never saw coming in the first place. You know, like the whole, I don't remember the name of the content creator, so I feel a little bad not being able to shout them out specifically, but the guy who made the build that constantly canceled his own portal cast in order to spam out, you know, spells, like that was not expected and is a very cool build.
You know what's crazy? Stuff like that. I was on week 1 of the league. There was like someone sent me a video of Billy showcasing the interaction, and I think I had forwarded it to GGG like right away. I was like, hey, there's no way this thing lives past like I'm not even gonna bother making a build with this. There's not a chance this thing lives. And I saw it come up like a month later on an actual build. And I'm like, what? Like when it comes to things like that, you know, like how often that's just like a bug basically, right? So
Sure. You know, I mean, you're correct. It is a bug. I think that has been addressed in this patch, but it's still extremely creative and cool to leverage that. Like,
wait, can I clarify right there then? Can I just
Sure.
take that as a piece? So you said it's cool to leverage a bug, and it's cool if I do that in the future,
no,
right?
Jug, no.
in
It's all
some
good, right?
contexts, this is an extremely blurry subjective line. So like, there is no like. People look for like this, you know, word from on high, this authoritative take on like, you know, okay, what can I do? What isn't a bug? Like, I can't anticipate the bugs that will be found. We try to. We have a QA department that's dedicated to trying to, but there might be, you know, there's always the chance that there's something in the game that, you know, I've overlooked, or you know, all of us as developers have overlooked that gets found, and then it just has to be subjectively assessed in that time. Like, it is really, unfortunately, just purely case by case.
No, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But Octavian, I'm kind of interested in your thoughts on like the OG question. Like, do you think that content creators are up to date with what is strong within the game, or do you think that, you know, are we playing in Freesia what was actually strong at the start of Keepers? Like, how good do you feel like the community and content creators specifically are at reading that meta balance that's within the game?
There's definitely some lag, for lack of a better term, I think there, but I think that's not necessarily like, I wouldn't want to say that's because, you know, the people playing the game at the highest level aren't smart enough to find these builds. There are definitely people who are making
I would
extremely
make
clever
that
builds.
comment for you. That's fine.
Well, no, because I have an interesting perspective on this, because I was a content creator for Path of Exile for years before joining the team, and if you want to be really successful at League Start, what you want to do, like the perfect build, is a build that has some new stuff going on that also is on a foundation that people trust. And then people will be like, oh, I know that this can be strong, but there's also some new cool interaction or new cool unique or whatever that it's using that can draw me in. Like, people want, you know, I know this is going to work. I know this is going to be foundationally good, and also a little bit of spice. Like, that's the perfect build guide. You know, you'll get the most traction, the most people watching, you know. So like, there is an incentive to innovate a little bit and not too much at League Start, to be honest.
Okay, so let's talk about that, because on top of like whether they're good or bad, there's obviously PoE for a new player especially, and for a lot of intermediate players. If you don't have a build guide, you struggle to play the game. Like, that's just straight up true. So how do you guys view like dev versus content creator relationship in terms of like actually putting out these good build guides? Because you're right, if you have someone put out a bad build guide, it completely destroys League Start for a lot of people. They never log into the game again. So how do you guys view that, and, you know, what's your current thought on GGG's relationship with like content creators and build guide management? And, you know, third-party tools as a whole, right? Path of Building is like just so handy to be able to actually use all these things. And I know that people have been asking for like in-client mapping out the passive tree and things like that. How do you view all of this symbiotic relationship?
Well, I mean, I think overall content creation for the game and build guides and stuff have been a massive boon. You're correct that there are occasionally, you know, maybe there's a build guide that goes out that doesn't do, you know, that people get baited into, for lack of a better word, that is, you know, maybe does ruin some people's League Start experience. But what we can really do on the dev side about that is just try and make the game more approachable in general, so that, you know, I don't think we'll get to the point where you don't necessarily need any build guide at all. We'll see. But we can definitely do more on that front. For one thing, like, the whole keywording system from PoE 2 is something that I'm personally really keen to bring back to PoE 1, because it's way better than the hold alt for reminder text system that we have right now. If we can get more ways to onboard people into the game without having to alt tab out to a wiki or go to a build guide, then the risk of that is minimized, right?
Where does the name of this podcast come from? Just heard the word bait.
I think people are really incendiary. You know, people will say all kinds of things. The truth is, I think that I have never, ever made a bad build. There's just bad players that copy them poorly. And if
you're better than me.
If a good player copied my bad
builds
build
on my
it would be
YouTube
good.
channel, they do not hold up.
Actually, maybe I guess. I mean, there's been. I think where does that come from is actually kind of interesting because let's say I have a reputation for baiting people with a build. Let's just say hypothetically, not saying that's the truth. I think a lot of it has to do with skill complexity. So there's a skill that I'm seeing on this current patch that I think might be incredibly bait. I think it is potentially powerful, but looks to be weak, and that's. I think it's Holy Hammer. It's the one where it's like you consume a power charge and you have the cascading thing. Is that Holy Hammer?
Mm-hmm. The row of hammers, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Holy
So
hammers.
there's been like speculation about overlaps and how much damage does this do? Because I think a lot of times we're trying to moneyball skills to get it down to if you do everything correctly in this way and you have the correct scalars for this skill and package it correctly, what is that damage effectiveness when you calculate attack speed and everything? I think there might be like overestimation on the Holy Hammer, for instance, because we don't know about the consistency of overlaps and how much damage it actually does. So from my perspective, I see that a lot of that risk or like whether something will be good or bad and that sort of like unknown factor and the complexity is actually just about not knowing how a skill functions, specifically as it pertains to hit rate, right? And I'm not sure like what you could or would even want to do to elucidate that better for players.
I don't know, because I think this fundamentally comes down to like what kind of player I am as well, because like we have this game that I'm like I said earlier is this incredibly complex puzzle, and that kind of encourages people to solve it, and it also attracts people who want to solve that puzzle. And for a lot of people, it's just about like solving the biggest number, like, or maybe you pick a skill and then from there you solve the biggest number for it. Whereas when I'm approaching a build, I more want to like get the numerical aspect of it to a point that's comfortable, and then it's about solving how the playstyle feels for me. I don't know. I feel like I'm not answering your question super well. I'm not trying to dance around it. I think I have a very different way of thinking about this sort of thing than necessarily translates well onto like, a DPS estimate or just numerical estimates of how effective a character is. Like that's just not necessarily how I look at a build most of the time.
Yeah, I feel like from a player's point of view, the new skills are like there's more excitement in not knowing how effective it is just by the numbers off the gem because of all those external factors, by not knowing the hit rates or the number of overlaps, for example. So I feel like I sort of like there not being perfect information going into a release for that.
I was going to say that's interesting because you got someone like Jung that's going to look at a skill and he's going to pull it apart, and if the damage effectiveness isn't high enough, he's just never going to touch the skill, right? He's like not even going to do it. Then I assume that there's like the average person that is like, oh, I played Paladin in all of these other games. There's now Paladin skills. No matter how little damage I do, I'm going to try and grind this one out and stick with the skill. And I guess like that becomes like nearly an economy question, because it's like, okay, if the skill operates in that way, then how far ahead or behind do you become in the economy? Because if you play a great skill, you get ahead if you play the game enough, and then you're able to make the skill even better. So I think that that's actually quite interesting, going back to the first area of like balance of like how you approach like how these skills operate within in a game that has such a big economy on League Start, because I think that is something that we were also quite interested in, is like, do you guys balance your skills around like, this is mainly a SSF player that's going to interact with chat a little bit? Or do you guys think about your skills as in like, hey, we have, especially in softcore trade, we have like a completely wide open economy. You have access to completely every single item in the game theoretically, and a lot of them are quite cheap after like 2 or 3 games. That's what we expect the players to be able to utilize to be able to create these build guides.
I will say that like when I'm approaching trying to come up with skill concepts, all of that is not unimportant, but it is secondary to, does this skill have a cool power fantasy? Like, does this skill have a cool, unique way that it functions and that fulfills a certain, like I want to be dropping giant hammers on huge packs of monsters, like that is why Holy Hammers exists. And then from there, it's okay, well, what spacing do we need on the hammers in order to have it be competitive in terms of overlap? What effectiveness does this skill need given that it functions this way? But like, we first determine how does the skill need to function in order to fulfill the cool base fundamental concept, and then work out the balance around that. And that sometimes means that you get to the point where you're trying to work out the balance around the cool base fundamental concept, and you just can't. And then the skill gets cut. There was actually one additional skill that was meant to go into this patch that, the concept was cool, but it didn't translate well enough in game into like actual play at a moment to moment level. And it's been hold. It'll maybe get redesigned and go into 329 with some changes, or a future patch, or become a unique item or something. We don't want to waste the assets that have been made, but yeah, like they're. That's not to say like it's only about power fantasy and class fantasy and whatever you want to call that, but it is like the starting point.
No, I think that's really cool. I love Crackling Lance. It's like one of my favorite abilities. Like I'll run it like probably like once every 2 leagues, even though I think it is a little bit like underpowered at the moment. Because like I just love the power fantasy of like big beam becomes small beam when I have to stand still and like concentrate it on something. Like it's just such a cool ability to me. So
Yeah,
I
I
do
will
agree.
say that
That's cool.
I think next patch, it has been tabled quite a few times already, but self-cast is definitely on our radar. Oh, and there is also a new exceptional support specifically for intensity-based skills, which might be pretty good with Crackling Lance this league.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, like sometimes we'll fall a bit short in terms of the balance on those class identities and fantasies, but like it's important to have them because you want skills to feel distinct, because otherwise you go back to the problem we discussed earlier where like every skill operates the same way, this one is 10% better, why would you use these other 5 skills, right? And it's hard not to fall into that trap, especially when you have triple digit number of skills in the game. But yeah, something like Crackling Lance is a good example where it's a cool concept that maybe just needs some more numerical love, and that could be in 329 or 330 or whatever. And it's good to have those cool concepts in the game because you can always buff numbers in a future patch.
To me, it seems like arriving on the right number has got to be really hard because of certain things as far as design space go. Like I think there's certain mechanics and items and skills that restrict the design space of everything else, because in their absence, you could be a bit more like relaxed, but with their presence, it becomes ridiculous. Like things like Penance Mark, for instance. I know like on release, I actually do want to hear about that specifically when it was like introduced, but at the time of Penance Mark's release, I remember building around it because I saw the trailer. I did a bunch of like screen measurements to see, okay, is this within 1.5 radius sometimes? And I made a whole low tolerance Pathfinder proliferation setup. Skill comes out, forget about what Peacock did on League Start, but now it's a 3.5 to 4.5 radius. And I saw, I guess, how problematic it would have been, but there's like that aspect. But then I think about like, even now, with that in Southbound, you get like massive issues with overlaps. I think Nimbus is another great example of an item that might have greatly restricted design space. I've always thought about what if I just like didn't do that. Like return projectiles, kind of setting what you can and can't do in terms of introducing new projectile skills, balancing that. Do you think there's like big problem outliers that you wish weren't there? Or is it just something that's more interesting now for your problem solving to create that puzzle?
Well, I think something like Nimbus to me is more fine because it is such an extremely rare in-game item. Like, yeah, for the average player, they're probably never seeing a Nimbus. What was the other example you gave, sorry?
Penance Mark.
Yeah, no, Penance Mark is getting near Worm Blaster in terms of like, or the Writhing Jar in terms of levels are problematic. Whenever we design a new skill, someone's like, but what about this and this with Penance Mark? So maybe it will be adjusted at some point because it does keep on cropping up in terms of our like QA testing.
Now, this should not be taken as there being any changes coming to this keystone, but like definitely not. Though maybe this will get clipped out of context still, we'll see. But like CI is the biggest example of this. You know, just immunity to a full damage type is very cool. Like that's super iconic. CI is an incredibly iconic keystone, and it's great that it's in the game, and it means we can't have an endgame boss that's full damage chaos, right? Because otherwise you play CI build, you're immune to it. You know, you can't have this thing that's supposed to be threatening and challenging do full chaos damage, or else suddenly you can click a keystone and be completely immune to it. So like it is, yeah, exactly. But like, if you want to put cool stuff in the game that's transformative and game changing, you have to build those constraints for yourself. It's impossible not to, or else everything is milk toast. You know, everything is like flat and vapid if you don't have interesting spiky constraints that you have to build around.
I definitely see like some things is adding more and some things is adding less in that way. Like I remember when I was going through the unique design process, when I was looking back at some of them, I'm like, oh yeah, given what happened in the next few patches, this would have adding this one item would have actually removed 3 different items, 4 different skills, and the possibilities for like 2 different skill trees. But when it comes to like overlaps and splash, I think that's always going to be one to consider. The other thing I had about that was, I guess like it was reminding me that Penance Marks, that specifically, the implementation, it basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, it changed from the time that from the trailer to when it was launched, right? The skill functionality.
I think yes. The radius at which the ghosts spawn around the monster was made further away, I'm pretty sure. I don't know if there were any other changes, but yeah, that was certainly the case.
So then, do you think there's been like an increasing degree of comfort from your guys' side in terms of changing the game, or like changing what's the state of balance or skill functionality or item functionality from the point at which the patch release happens on Thursday, to when the patch actually drops on Friday, or sorry, the trailer on Thursday to when the patch drops on Friday? Because I feel like from my perspective, there's been a lot more. Every day we have like a brand new list of notes, whereas back in the day it felt a little bit more conservative in that way.
Well, I guess also it is, we used to drop the patch notes on
Right.
the Wednesday before the release. So we do the patch notes far earlier than before. So I guess it hasn't really changed our like freneticism in terms of like trying to get more and more changes in just before release.
Yeah, I guess you're now just like seeing a lot of the changes that would have previously been invisible at that point, because yeah, there is usually, last week before release, there's something that comes together and we didn't realize, this is going to be a problem, and then unfortunately you have to fix it. I want to avoid that as much as possible. Like, I really dislike, one of my favorite things about the role, about the job, is being able to like show players cool stuff, and I really dislike when I show a player a cool thing and then it's like, oh wait, no, actually we have to change that. So I want to try and minimize that as much as humanly possible, but sometimes it slips through.
What do you guys think about your timings at the moment? Because I know, Octavian, in the Ziz interview, you were saying that you love that there's a certain amount of undiscovered things going into every new patch, and sure, it gets data mined and stuff, but the average player probably isn't looking at that. Do you guys now like the change where the patch notes are way earlier and people get a longer time to plan, or do you think that there is a way that you would go back to, like maybe later patch notes and having a little bit more surprise going into the actual league start week? And I remember like waking up, like I'm Australian, like waking up at like 2-3 a.m. putting the final touches on builds, the morning of the league launching.
I think personally, I preferred the patch notes being on the Wednesday, but the reason for that was because I feel like on the Friday of the live stream, you get too much information overload, because you have the live stream, all the new stuff, and then you also have the patch notes. So having like that teaser season prolonged from like the live stream, and then you're also looking forward to the patch notes in a few days.
This isn't going to translate into a change of policy on this front. This is just purely a personal opinion. I really like having stuff in the game that isn't in the patch notes that players can discover. Like I said on the Ziz podcast, this time around, that's all the like little campaign improvements. Like that's kind of where I put that energy. There's a bunch of little rooms in the campaign, little rewards and stuff. We showed one. I specifically asked that we not show more than one because I want them to be discovered. I want them to be found. And also that is the kind of thing that's relatively safe from data mining, thankfully, because I don't think, maybe I'm wrong on this front, but I don't think data miners can actually access like the specific locations of things within the files that control level generation.
I think uniques are the other place that's like really well hidden before the patch. Like we have no idea what most of the uniques are, and like with last patch Fileborns, it like drastically shifted what the meta is, their accessibility and everything. So like I think there's other places where there's a lot of undiscovered potential.
I mean, it calls back to that tension that I was talking about earlier, back when I was, live streaming the game for a living, where like before league start, our game is very complex, obviously, and people just want to know that their league start is going to be comfortable and good and solid. And so that, I think that is what drives a lot of the desire to have as much information as possible, because you want to know all the variables so that you can have a comfy league start. And I relate to that to some degree, but also I really, really like the whole community discovery aspect of it in the first week, where you see these posts of people going like, oh, look at this cool thing that I found that we haven't seen yet. This cool new unique. So there's a balance there to be struck. I think releasing, skill changes, character changes, ascendancy changes, passive tree, all of that is very important, having that ahead of time. But new uniques, yeah, I don't think I'd ever want to start teasing tons and tons of those before launch.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure if the exceptional supports can be data mined or not. I think they can, which is a little unfortunate. But I think you can infer where they're from, mostly from their flavor text and name, potentially. That will be the more interesting thing, how to get them all.
For those ones as well, like I'm more okay with those being something that the community discovers, because they're very much less likely to impact your league start plan, because it's not something you get until you defeat end game bosses probably multiple times.
I'm with you. Like one of my favorite recent leagues was actually Mercenaries, and it was because it went from these things are useless to these things can buff you amazingly to every single day on Reddit like a different person posting how their merc is now soloing the whole game and they're sitting there doing nothing. And like the evolution of that was like actually so cool to like watch. And like I think that if that had been solved beforehand, that would have been like a real downer on that league in particular.
I think I like the uniques thing. I think the old uniques is where I might have more concern insofar as, and this is the only time I'll lobby in this whole session. Is there any chance that when you guys change the unique tiering of a specific unique, that there might be a more public communication of that? To contextualize this, in ArchNem, I made a build for Nightblade, Perfect Agony, Spectral Helix, using Ungles, which was the most common unique tier at the time, or maybe second most common. And that, for some reason, it was bad, by the way. That build was bad. You can talk about bait builds. That build was worse than just not. I unclicked Perfect Agony and that build got better. Anyways, that patch, Ungles went up to, I think, T1 or T2. In like kind of in secret. So like on the league start, it was one of the more inaccessible items. I wonder, could we have like a communication of that when that does happen? Because for instance, this patch we have Foulborn Ghost Wrath. Will things like that be accessible, or that'll be like hard to get?
I hope not. That's so fun.
Well, interestingly, it is now easier to know when a unique has changed rarity
Right.
on release than before, because you can just go to ROG in King's March and see how much dust it sells for. I was actually contemplating if that is like if we wanted to make it more secret, and that when we change the rarity of uniques, we don't actually affect their dust cost at all. But honestly, I don't really have a strong opinion either way on whether or not we should be revealing. I just know that historically we haven't really announced weighting changes to the players.
Yeah,
You should do
this
that.
Is something
That's amazing,
that we would
by the way.
probably we would probably need to loop Mark, maybe Jonathan, in on this, because it is a very established historical trend with this game and PoE 2. So I wouldn't want to make that call without at least consulting them.
When an item's normal version is not very, like, it's fine, but like, not exceptional, but then the Foulborn version of the item is insanely powerful. Let's use Gothros for the example. Like, is there ever going to be a splitting of the tiers, or are they always similar tiers? And again, like, I understand this is probably not a concrete answer area, but
I will say we have the ability to control like what percentage of a time the unique does become Foulborn, or if it has more than one Foulborn outcome, we can like make one of those outcomes rarer than the other. So I'm not gonna like say which ones are rare and which ones are common, but yeah, we do that for a few of them.
I hear what you're saying. It scares me what you're saying, Andrew, in particular, for sure. I think like the only reason why is, or the greatest positive that I see is like the potential for build heterogeneity at league start. Insofar as like, I think Paul Strom was kind of ranting about this the other day. The idea that all his league starts kind of need to be all based around blue or rare items, which is in a sense, in a vacuum, neither here nor there. But in terms of what you could do in terms of distinct builds that feel different, that are different right away, it becomes a lot hard to set plans for that, right? And so then your league start kind of looks like, oh, let's just play, Explosive Arrow Ballista for the 10th time. Like, let's go slams again until we know. Let's do this again until we know. KBOC until we know. I feel like that could be like a really big upside, right? In terms of knowing what's still accessible to us. Not so much the new uniques, but just knowing that.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, I don't feel like the majority of unique items actually like bias towards one skill over another. Like most uniques are more of like, I mean, there are certainly a few where it's like, for example, Kinetic Fusillade, you want to stack as much reduced duration as possible. So you really need like 2 or 3 key uniques in that sense. But for the majority of the skills, I don't think they're like super unique dependent.
Okay. How do you feel, Spawn? Bounce?
I'm happy. I think that all the unique stuff. I don't know if you want to move on to a different topic, but I've got what I need.
I did want to kind of delve deeper into that content creator thing, in terms of how they impact, and streamers and build guys and all that, how they impact the meta, how they impact how people see builds and skills. Beyond just that, do you guys see it as like, or is there some perspective of it as like a bit of an arms race between creator and developer when it comes to that?
I'm not sure I follow. Like, an arms race in what way?
Let's say there are currently 5 really overpowered skills in HC racing. Let's just say hypothetically, and one of them is known as Seismic Trap. And then next patch we discover like, I'm gonna wait and then release like DD Ignite for next patch. And then you guys are nerfing that, like, oh, can't wait for this guy to do this again, and so on and so on. Are you guys worried about, or are you guys excited about that sort of dynamic appearing? Because I've felt that way at times. Let's put it that way. Sort of adversarial nature in terms of balancing.
I don't know that there's really much that we can do about that. Like oftentimes it goes back to the whole philosophy of skill balance in PvE games being partially to try and make it not feel like there's one thing that is just drowning out everything else, right? And so if a skill becomes popularized because it's incredibly strong to the point where it feels like it's drowning out everything else. We kind of need to address that. And or if we don't, we lead to a stale meta, and that is something that people very much dislike. So whether that was because it got popular just because the numbers are obviously insane, or got popular because, you know, one person was super responsible for that popularity, like how it got to that point doesn't seem as relevant to me as like just addressing a stale meta if one comes up.
Is how like biggest popularity of skills still factoring in? Because I know it used to be like really publicly mentioned as the premier thing that you guys look to in terms of reducing power.
It's probably because of the perception, or I don't know, probably because of the fact that people will become very unhappy with a stale meta. Popularity factors in because that is a large part of what determines what a meta is. I wouldn't say it's the sole factor. Like any time that I come to Andrew with, you know, hey, maybe we should take a look at this skill or this archetype or whatever, Andrew's response is always to pull up a bunch of spreadsheets and start comparing balance numbers and comparing damage numbers. Like it's not like, ooh, this is really popular, make the numbers 20% lower. But it can be an impetus point for like looking at it and seeing, well, is this actually a problem? Is this actually overpowered? And in the case of like Detonate Dead, yeah, the answer is was often yes.
I was going to say there's like often it's not necessarily the skill itself, but there's external factors around the skill which could be problematic instead. Like Detonate Dead. Well, Detonate Dead is very, very closely tied to Desecrate. But for example, we had years and years of players having lots of different specters so they could pollute their Desecrate pool with more and more high life minions, which is a very PoE thing to do. But at some point, it's like we're balancing around a very non-intuitive way of playing the skill. So that's the reason we'd want to get rid of it.
You know what's really intuitive, but I hate, is stackers. How do you guys feel about stackers right now?
When you say stackers, are you talking about like attribute stackers or herald stacking, or is there a particular type of stacking?
I think the last time I ever talked to Chris Wilson, he said Righteous Fire was the most problematic skill in the game. This is a decade ago. Because it lets you scale life and damage at the same time. And I talk about this a lot. These days, the premier builds, I think, for endgame are still Energy Shield stack. There's a life stack, Great Wind setup, power charge stacking with Eternal Separation, like Elgin Hubris, and then strength stacking. And seeing that kind of convergence, I think, in the endgame towards stacking has made some people kind of feel like build making is more linear now, less interesting, less complex, I guess, at least in terms of horizontality. Do you guys like the presence of stackers, their current power? Do you guys like that kind of building? Just general thoughts, I guess.
It's a very thorny balance problem that I've been kind of bouncing around in my head for a number of leagues now, because it has the upside of giving you builds that have these like really, really high ceilings that you can keep incrementally improving, and that's a good thing. We like, you know, we don't want a build to become static, like at reaching level 92 or whatever, and you have, you know, you're just kind of done. But then the other problem is exactly what you're saying. Like it sort of funnels the build making meta into, you know, pick your top level thing that you're stacking around and then find ways to stack around that, be that ward, int, dex, strength, ES, life, whatever. And PoE1 has become so complex with so many different avenues at this point that like it's just proliferated to a lot of different parts of the game. But it's not something that we should be like super hasty with going and just chopping away at. There are upsides and downsides here, and the perfect solution would retain some of the upsides while making it feel less one-dimensional. This is also the kind of thing that I feel like is a problem for the 1% of the 1%. You know, like it's a problem for people who are getting to that level 95 plus build and really investing in like, you know, then making another build and maybe making another build and feeling like all of the build making is very similar. You know, it's not the kind of thing that's a problem if you know, play one build a league to level 90 and then finish. So I don't know. I feel like I maybe went on a little circuitous rant there, but regardless, like it is something that's been on my mind. I just can't speak to any specific changes because I haven't figured out any specific changes. It's the same thing. There's a number of problems at any given moment that are always just in the back of my head, and I'm trying to come up with a solution. And usually something pops into my head at 2 a.m. some random day. You know, Mercenaries is on that same list. Like how Mercenaries? How? And eventually my brain will present some kind of answer. We'll see if it's a good one. I hope so.
The way I see it is that it's about a separation of offense and defense, right? Because all the skill and mana and armor stacking are the same. All of these stackers are able to really scale at a very high level, both offense and defense at the same time. But you'll notice one I'll never mention is dexterity stacking. Because I think the only defensive scaler for dexterity, save for like during free shot and whatnot, is guard cons, basically. You could say Shaper's Touch, right? So isn't it about the separation of those things, which kind of, from what I understand, used to be one of the core principles in terms of introducing like mechanics, items, and skills.
Yeah, I feel like over time we have added more and more things that scale both offense and defense, or scale damage off life, or scale damage off the energy shield, stuff like that. And it's certainly, like it's been brought up, as like the more and more of those mechanics you add in, they're like multiplicative with each other. So it's like making those builds stronger and stronger over time. Like it certainly has been on our radar for a while, and we are making a couple of nerfs this patch to energy shield stackers in particular. But we will I think we probably will make future nerfs to these type of builds.
I was wondering if it was like quantitative or qualitative from your perspective, but that's interesting to hear it that way.
I want to completely change the topic for a little bit. Crafting is a skill in PoE that I think like is really entertaining to watch, and the people that craft the best are like actually like can separate themselves into another tier. I think crafting leagues lately have become a little bit, they do all crafting better than the other crafting mechanics in the game. Like, you know, the tree, for example, just spit out fractures better than anything else, spit out like high DPS axes better than anything else, spit out like everything better than anything else. And then like I go back to Necro, that was kind of the same. Every single piece of the gear eventually was like double fractured off Necropolis. Then you go back to like even Harvest. Does that make you scared to introduce new crafting mechanics into the game? And if not, do you think that the current power level of like, because I think you need to engage in the league mechanic. It needs to be slightly better than the other mechanics in the game, probably on launch. But it just seems like the power dynamic seems a little bit off to me at the moment, because it feels like if it's a crafting league, it feels like I don't engage in the other avenues of crafting probably as much as I would.
I think it was definitely slightly unintentional how strong the breach equipment tree went out, and it took away a lot from like fossils from my point of view, because it's basically doing fossils but with like mod tier rating on top of it. But I also agree that if you're going to have a crafting league, then you need to make sure the crafting is front and center, so it does need to be relatively powerful and feel good to players. Do you have anything on that?
What it kind of needs to do is iterate in a different novel direction from previous crafting methods. And that's where I think both Necropolis and the tree kind of failed. Because they essentially were just, here's crafting and it's very good, and they don't have like, you know, some new thing that they're doing that isn't something that the other systems can do. Because if you can, and that's just really hard, by the way, like the crafting system in Path of Exile 1 is so tight and so, you know, extensive with so many things going on that it's really hard to iterate in a new and meaningful way. And that's probably why the tree and Necropolis didn't, because there just wasn't some fundamental new thing to throw in at the time. So like going forward, if we have a league, you know, Mirage is not super heavy on the crafting, though there are a few things you can find in Mirages through other league mechanics that may impact crafting decisions, but it's not like a crafting league, so to speak. If we have a league in the future that is more crafting centric, I'd want to make sure that it has some new, unique, novel selling point that the crafting can be built around, because then you can put the power budget there rather than putting the power budget into just, okay, it makes rares with really big numbers.
Yeah, that makes sense, because from my perspective, the thing that I liked about Necropolis is like I was playing, I think, Poison Molten Strike at the time. Like I still had to go to Heist to actually get the corpse to be able to make my pneumatic daggers, right? So I still had to engage with different parts of the game to be able to do the crafting that like I needed to do. Whereas it has felt like in the past, some of the leagues were like you just did the core game of mapping and then you were able to access, as you said, like fossils, or, you know, it seemed like strange that it would pull you away from the part of the game that item came to. But I really like that you guys are addressing that at the moment. I don't know if you feel similarly.
An emphasis on all league mechanics, and we're not in that place yet. We're certainly not in that place. But an emphasis on all league mechanics having some interesting, unique draw that you would want to do that thing for is very important to me personally. Like that I think is what gives the game its longevity, or is one of the foundational things that gives the game its longevity. Being able to go like, oh, I want to specifically, build around and invest into Heist or Delve or Delirium or Blight or whatever, and be rewarded in a way for doing that I wouldn't be rewarded in for doing one of the other choices I could have picked.
Is there like a favorite crafting system for each of you guys?
It's definitely ROG from Expedition.
Oh.
And I think the reason I love ROG so much is because it just strikes the right balance between non-determinism and having a lot of player skill knowledge to like leverage your way to like economic returns effectively. So it's like, yeah, strikes the right balance between RNG and like me thinking that my skill is what is causing me to do well when I'm crafting from ROG.
ROG is a really interesting one because he doesn't actually give you anything that you couldn't get from other systems. It's more like the way of interacting with it is the thing that's unique there.
Yes, I also like how he gives you like very strange items sometimes. Like he'll give you some crazy looking item which is like might be hyper specifically very good for some random person's build, and it ends up selling for a lot.
Personally, probably fossils and resonators and Delve in general. I mean, it's probably one of the reasons why we started there for this whole trying to make League mechanics more sequestered and contained, is because I have a soft spot for Delve, and I like the fossil resonator system. I think it's pretty solid, despite it being almost a decade old at this point. God,
Yeah, we definitely still
maybe
use
not
them
quite that old.
It's cool because Delve has like the two big like kind of cleavages in crafting where like you can just spam a dense fossil and get some pretty good stuff, but then when you want to make your higher end items, you can like deeply invest where every resonator is costing like 5 and 6 more plus divines per like slam. From my perspective, I really thought one of you guys would have said like Recombinator. What are the thoughts? Or I guess Sentinel broadly, because it's a progressive crafting system that's like actually building on other things, right? But it's still separate.
I think I do like Recombinators. I think the main thing I don't like about it is the opaqueness of it, and also how much like expert knowledge you sort of need to know, because there's weird things going on behind the scenes regarding like exclusive mods and that type of thing. It's a little less clear to players exactly like how to take best advantage of it.
Yeah, it's a cool system that's not communicated as well as it could otherwise be. So there might be work to be done there. I do remember when I first joined the company, one of the first things that I asked one of the designers I was talking to at the time is, okay, so when are Recombinators coming back? It was like a month after I joined in QA.
What was that?
What was that?
League would that have been? What league would that have been?
I think I joined basically as Sentinel was finishing up.
Oh, okay. So, okay. You've been kind of pushing behind the scenes. I think like they're so... I get what you're saying about the complexity thing. I feel like that's what makes it interesting to me, because my biggest problem with Tree this patch was how simple it was. Like, the power is its own issue that can just be like, it's a lever that can be pulled, right? You can just change numbers. But the sheer simplicity of crafting from it, I didn't like. It was like, I want defense, I want Machi, I want this, and I just press it. Whereas like Recom, learning about the hidden rules, like I think having the... It's not... I wouldn't call it intuitive, but they didn't feel like bugs to me. They didn't feel like things that were generally problematic, but they still had you like thinking about the game. Had you think about like what's possible? How do you think about why these things are possible? And then once you figure out why one thing was possible, you start thinking about why other things aren't. And I would like worry then that as we separate crafting systems and reduce complexity, that we start to lose the possibility of that, right?
Yeah, I feel like the breach tree is more like a means of getting your starting item, but given how powerful it was, it probably was like, yeah, this is your starting item and your finishing item. As in, like, once you generate the rare item, you don't need to go through further crafting systems to iterate on it. But I do also share your love for, like, just loading up Craft of Exile and, like, being like, this is the item I want to end up with. How do I get there? And then just messing around and seeing what different things I can do to maximize my odds of building that specific item.
And like all the weird little ways in which an item can be hyper specific is one of the things that drew me to Path of Exile in the first place, and has just gotten more and more over time. Like you can have this item, you can have one of those heist rings with extra suffixes, and then maybe one of them is fractured and you've synthesized or changed the implicit, though I don't think that actually works on the heist rings, so maybe a bad example. Like you can mess with the implicits, you can mess with the corruptions, you can mess with the explicits a whole ton, you can have enchantments and stuff, and I wouldn't want to reduce that. No, I love how crazy and weird items or rare items in particular can get eventually on like some giga endgame build.
When I'm thinking about that, it's like the random item stuff I would like a lot. I like the idea of like having these weird items. Lastly, I made a character that was based around a ring that had -200 mana on it. It was like a helical and I got like a lot of reduced mana. I had I think 80 total mana at the very end, and I did permanent Sap of Seasons with that because it also had like 200 mana regen. It was some weird bricked mirrored ring. But at the same time, what I'm thinking is like all the systems we're talking about actually don't really interact with each other, right? Like fracturing orbs are kind of the cross-cutting thread that makes a lot of crafting systems I feel interact with each other. And a lot of times I don't necessarily mind or not mind whether things are made in isolation. I think it's kind of cool when like, oh, this slot for your build is best made through this system and this slot is through this system. But like that's what is really drawing me constantly over and over again back towards like Recombinator. And I feel like the interaction between systems, I worry about that. A lot of systems.
Do you think that's actually true though? Like, because I think like maybe at the top end that's true, but I think like, you know, essences into like Jun slams and stuff is like probably where a lot of like the base player base crafting stops, you know. So like I think like there are some systems that overlap, and then like I mean I'm a fan of Rug as well, and then I'll just get some items that have like good modifiers and I'll just like slam them together on a recombinator to see if they actually turn into anything good, and if not they just get deleted. I think like the systems are in a pretty healthy spot from a casual perspective, I guess.
I think one of the changes that I was surprised went under the radar so much from last patch is all the harvest crafts now respecting meta mods. Like I made some very powerful items this patch and I'm like, is this busted? But I didn't see people talking about it very much, so maybe it's not as busted as I thought it was.
I think part of it is something like the Breach Tree or like Necropolis crafting. It's safer from a design standpoint to design it in such a way that it doesn't cross-pollinate with other systems, because then you reduce the chance that you've, you know, overlooked some incredibly busted interaction. But you're absolutely correct. It's also less interesting. So yeah, like I said earlier, if we do another crafting league going forward, I'd like for it to be more distinct, having its own kind of spin that it brings to the table, and then also probably functioning with other systems in some ways if it can. What that looks like, I don't know off the top of my head, but I want to find out.
How does Groundlet fit into the crafting system conversation at the moment? Because like to me, at the high end, best gear normally does come from stuff that you make, and I like that about Path of Exile. But I mean, there is a lot of conversation about, you know, items on the ground and people just hide everything apart from a certain eye level base. You know, where does that fit into your head when it comes to crafting?
Well, I don't think we're making like huge strides to address that or anything this patch, but we are basically saying that all those starting point items, like the items that generate with like very high modifier tier rating, are getting worse from sources like King's March and the Gambler and the Breach Tree, but better from Memory Strands, which is ground loot. And Memory Strands also has that advantage that even once you identify the item, all of your future crafts on that item are better because of the whole like the strands add mod tier rating.
Yeah, I used strands for like the first time this league for like crafting, and the complexity there was, or, like the things that you could do were pretty crazy, especially like thinking about like beasts and like shifting bases. Whereas when it first came out, I was like, yo, this seems useless. Like I think the player lag in terms of understanding systems is definitely there. And right now when you're saying the harvesting, I'm still lagging really far behind, man. I don't know where you're at. Don't say anything though. I have no idea what you're talking about still. Like in terms of like what would be more OP than we already did before.
Well, I think it's more like in Harvest you have things like reroll.
More likely.
What is it? Reroll an item with a fire mod or a speed mod or whatever it is. Those didn't used to respect like prefixes cannot be changed and suffixes cannot be changed. But I think we changed that last patch.
It was a result of introducing the new wand bases that have those implicits where they can't roll caster modifiers, I believe, because those work on the same system and they needed to function with that. Yeah. So it was just kind of a side effect.
That always worked, I think. We've been doing that forever.
Yeah, I could be wrong. There was definitely something related to Harvest which changed. But maybe I'm like
attack, right? Like that's what it would have been?
Maybe.
I'd have to get the patch notes in front of me. There's been too many of them since then. I can't remember it all specifically off the top of my head.
I think there's some that have always worked, and now you're saying that all of them work now. I know for sure that like prefixes, suffixes can't be changed always worked.
Yeah, so those two work. The table which drives that functionality was changed at a fundamental level to allow for the new wand bases to function. I know that much. Like that's where the change came from, but I don't remember all the specifics of all the ramifications.
I can see why that would line up then with like cannot roll caster and cannot roll attack. In terms of this looting thing, and this is probably a conversation that happened 15 years ago, and it's just me not knowing. What if just everything was ID'd? And like I know there's an overlance on filter in that case, but
I think the biggest reason for this is like people, it's just going to explode the complexity of what an item filter should look like.
Yeah,
is the main thing. And playing games like Last Epoch, might be one of my biggest problems with that game.
That's where
is because everything drops ID'd I feel like I need to build these like hugely complex filters, and I need to be hovering over items like constantly during maps. I don't know. There's something about it which I dislike fundamentally.
I may farm some L's in chat saying this, but also I like identifying items. Like I like, I play in hardcore trade often, which is a smaller economy, or I play in group found settings, where rares, still have some value. Like I'll pick up rings, I'll pick up amulets mostly. Maybe I'll pick up high level bases of the kinds of bases that I'm using for my build, that sort of thing. And I like identifying the item and that moment of like, ooh, could this be good? Oftentimes, 90% of the time, no. But then 10, 5, 2% of the time, it's good enough that I keep it. And that's cool. I like that moment personally. I understand that may be something that a lot of people don't care for or relate to, but like just on a subjective level, I like to identify rare gear.
When I think about it, it's like the sound engineering side of things helps that a lot, because I do hear the sound of IDing the item and the feedback that provides me in my like chest area. I was like talking to my like friends who don't play PoE about like, yeah, I guess like one of the reasons we still play like that tink sound, like things like that. And I think a lot of the sound engineering provides that satisfaction. The ID thing, I hear what you're saying for sure. I think that's where it comes from for me, if that's there.
One of the really old series on my YouTube channel is just me IDing tabs full of jewelry and price checking it and then listing it. Like that was actually what started to get me an audience in the first place way back in the day. I would rather we try and address loot to the point where, there are some rares dropping sometimes, not hundreds. I don't want people picking up multiple inventories worth of stuff to ID. That gets tiresome real fast. But, you pick up a handful of items in the course of a map that you identify and assess. Do you want to keep it? Do you want to vendor it? And then you get rid of it if you don't want it. Like that is a fun draw for me, not a frustrating annoyance. I do understand for some people maybe it's the inverse, but that subjectively that is how I feel.
I like never have strong thoughts on this, I think, because the balancing of quantity and rarity seems like there's a lot of things that when people talk about, I'm like, oh, I have ideas about what prescriptions might be. When I think about everything that could be useful, it never makes sense just like call up a bunch of items to me. And there's like times in which, especially during like SF races, my entire filter is switching. Basically every single base is changing. Eye levels are changing, everything's changing. So I don't know, like I think it was just in here, but I have like no prescription or kind of slant in that direction.
Honestly, I think the ground loot thing's been talked about a lot. I'm kind of with Octavian. I like IDing stuff. I am interested in the dopamine feedback loop that you guys just spoke about with the noises, though. I actually have like a little bit of a funny anecdote. When PoE 2 came out, we were all creating our loop filters. One of my friends put exalts on tinks because like he was like, I just want to hear tinks every now and again. And then 2 weeks into the league, he's like, this filter completely sucks. Like I'm just tinking like every 2 seconds. It's completely destroyed the game for me. So how do you guys balance that dopamine kind of feedback reaction? Do you guys think it's in a good spot? I know that people are saying divines are too rare at the moment, like maybe chase items are not happening as often as they want. Like, is there a sweet spot that you guys talk about in terms of like how often you guys want people getting that really big feeling when they play the game? Because I've never dropped a floor mirror, for example, and I'm sure that like, I think I've got like 8,500 hours. So like the day that happens, I'm sure I'll be very happy.
What's easy to design there is the mirror. What's easy to design there is the thing that happens 1 in a bajillion times and is super exciting when it happens because you just set the weighting stupid low and you make the item really powerful. What's hard to design there is the middle class, so to speak. Like it's easy to make a super common currency that nobody cares about and they'll hide on their filter like a transmute, and it's easy to make a mirror, but it's hard to make something that sits in that middle space that is exciting but drops often enough that it doesn't feel completely impossible to get. And part of pulling ancient orbs and fracturing orbs into the core drop pool is an attempt to further populate that middle ground. Because if we were to just make, and we are making divine orbs more common with the currency changes, but if we were to make divine orbs as common as say alterations, just as an extreme example, they wouldn't be a tink anymore, right? Like everybody would have 1,000 divine orbs, so they would be worthless. So you can't just arbitrarily pull down the rarity so much that it gets to that point. But there might be some merit to like maybe this thing is a little bit too rare and it needs to drop a little bit more often to give people a little bit more in the way of the dopamine hit. So yeah, I don't know. But you do that too much and then you have the problem that existed, back when I was streaming the game and playing it regularly, where it felt like there wasn't nearly enough in the way of chase drops. Basically, for a chase drop to exist, definitionally, most people can't drop it. or if everybody's dropping it, it's no longer a chase drop. Like I said, those ones are the easy ones though. Like just set the rarity stupid low. That's not difficult. It's the middle class that's hard.
Yeah, I think it's more to do with the fact that it's like what proportion of all the valuable drops in the game are coming from the ground, because what is a valuable drop is entirely constructed by the players and whoever sets up the filters. So it's what we are doing a little bit this league is shifting more of the very valuable drops in the game from other places into ground loot. So, and not to say we will monitor this topic and do it more in the future. Like, for example, it's the whole like contention between window loot and ground loot. Arguably, you could say it's boss loot as well, but I think bosses having a bunch of exclusive valuable rewards is completely fine.
And then another thing that came to my mind when we're talking about this is the value of the currency to a player base versus the value of the click. I feel like divines at the moment, like especially for uniques, have like skewed very hard, where I assume the majority of player base like actually just don't click a divine on an item at the moment because they're like, I can buy something like way more valuable with this. Whereas in the past, I'm sure that was with Exalt. So like, what are your thoughts on like the actual value of a currency versus the usability of the currency?
Well, divines are a very strange one because the value of a divine in a trade league isn't actually based on the function of the divine itself. It's based on what it's used for in the crafting bench.
Yep.
I think I was one of the big proponents of the big Exalt divine switch back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the reason for that primarily was Exalts are a currency we want players to be using quite frequently, whereas divine orbs are not really. They're supposed to be for like perfecting an item at the very late game. And having divines be like very expensive in a trade league means that random uniques you find on the ground are more likely to be valuable. Because if it high rolls, then you can't just cheaply divine it.
Yeah, that was like good. My Moonstone rings like were on my filter last patch for like multiple items, which was like pretty crazy. Even when I'm like trying to push like 30, 40 DNR. Never would have expected that. On the UX side, I've been really curious about that in general. So I'm gonna start with an example, the most annoying example for me, and I'm gonna set this in context. So today we still can't move boss hotbars, and they get in the way of like all our buffs and debuffs and stuff, right? That's like, I think we probably can generally see that as a problem. But every time that this is being introduced as a topic publicly, we kind of get the comparison to World of Warcraft and like, you know, weak auras and all that thing. I wonder if you guys have plans to change the degree of customization in the near future. For me, FF14 oftentimes kind of had the right balance in terms of how much you could move things, how much you could customize without kind of losing the common look and feel. And I'm also wondering, like, what is the UX flow for you guys? When does that come into process?
I don't mean to disappoint you, but I feel like Andrew and myself are not the people who are most qualified to talk about this. This is something that, you know, both Mark and Jonathan feel very strongly on, and not just them, but also our like UI department. So I don't mean to dodge the question. I'm more just not actually really capable of answering it in a meaningful way. You know, like I can definitely say the previous established talking points of we want the game to have a consistent feel, and we want the game, and part of that feel comes from the UI and the intentionality of its design. But as to whether or not you'll be able to tweak that more, you know, specific changes that might be coming, just not in my field. Sorry.
Do you think we just get the guy to let us move the boss hotbar this patch?
Say that again?
Can we just get the ability to move the boss hotbar or make it smaller? The health bar, sorry.
I have a list, a specific document of QOL and UI stuff that I need to pitch to Jonathan and Mark. I will put it on that. I will make sure it gets mentioned.
I'm pretty sure there is like issues in the issue tracker for the problem in both PoE1 and PoE2 of like the boss's health bar, including your buffs, and reworking the buff UI in general. But I can't put a time frame on that at all. I have no idea what the status is.
I think like,
yeah, I think it's really interesting, right? Because when Jung and I were talking about this, there's like two different things. It's like the current rateability is bad, and I'm sure that's like very high on your guys' list. And I'm sure as players, you guys can like sympathize with what people are saying. And then there's the next thing where Jung was like, I want to turn off the ability to see my own ability. And I was like, well, no one else wants that. That is just completely ridiculous. Why you want to run around?
I didn't
with
say that in
ghost
public,
abilities?
dude.
So like
I love skill MTX, and I always buy every Herald MTX for my skills that I want.
And like there is a middle game between the middle ground between these two things. So I was just wondering, like, as players, where do you feel like there's customization, but B, there's functionality. Like, how do you feel that's going at the moment?
The boss bar thing specifically is frustrating. Yeah. I would like to get some kind of good change there, particularly because it feels like we're stepping on our own toes a little bit, and it's not great. But like I said, it's not something that I can really make a call on. So I don't want to promise anything that we won't be delivering, but I'll make sure to find time to talk to them about it.
No, I don't think it's about promises for me. It's like I think sometimes the community just loves to hear that the people that are making the game also share similar frustrations, and it's like not a lack of effort for like actually trying to get these things through. Like another
Oh,
thing
for
is
sure.
like the list of map mobs on the right side of the screen. Like I wish I could like just show the ones that I really care about, so I remember that they're in my map before they one
Mhm.
shot me. But then I just don't want to have the whole list every single time I go in because the list is like quite high sometimes. Maybe it'll go down now that tier 17s are out. But that was another one on the top of my head where it's like, I wish there was just a customization where it's like, okay, if there are volatiles in this map, then it will always show me that there's volatiles, but I don't have to look at the whole list every single time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, as a really specific point adjacent to that, like we removed a bunch of T17 mods that were frustrating to players this league. One of the ones we removed at the end of that list was the whole like when you get a bunch of impales, they explode and deal damage and all that. And we removed that one specifically because I hated that it had this 4-line long description that would go off your screen when it's in
Yeah.
the top right corner. So like yeah, we share some of these frustrations. Like that one wasn't removed because it was OP. That one probably wasn't even really that dangerous, to be fair. It was just gone purely for the UI portion of it, which is on me. I am the one who designed that modifier, but won't go back and clean up my own mistake.
I've died to that mod before. I'm be straight up. I died to that in Gauntlet. Like I just had
Well,
bad PR, and like there's a massive spike. It's actually huge.
well, you won't die to it anymore.
I'll find other things. Don't you worry. On that note, actually, PO, and I know you guys aren't in charge of this, so just at a personal level, esports and racing. Is this something you guys like talk about frequently in the office? What are like the general perspectives on this? I know that like there's a lot in terms of community run, but it feels like increasingly you guys are more supportive when it does happen. I've had like pretty decent support when I try to do things. And then to what extent does that affect balance, game design, and how you guys actually create the game from patch to patch?
See, to me, that feels like a kind of emergent thing that comes out of the game. I'd rather not it impact design super specifically because it's like to me the speedrunning and the racing should be like, okay, we have this final product, we have this game, now let's see how we can massively break it and find ways to do things really fast and skip stuff, rather than like us designing specifically a product for the maximum ease of use on that front. But that's just on the design side of things. On the community team support side of things, I think it's great to support more of these endeavors. To have more events, to have more, competitive Path of Exile out there. I just wouldn't want to design the game around it. That doesn't feel correct to me.
I guess from a personal perspective, how do you guys feel that the aspirational aspect of PoE is like? Do you see like Ben as like the god PoE gamer because he just wins every gauntlet? Like, is it FUD because he farms the most currency? Like, what do you like personally for you? What is aspirational Path of Exile? I guess.
I feel like definitely Ben, I think, is probably the archetypical like best PoE player just because of his expertise and like well, I think those like basically in those type of races he's leveraging all the tools necessary to like take down Ubers, whether that's a combination of like leveling very fast but also knowing how to itemize and create a build that's strong enough to handle all of like the tests at the very end of the end game, rather than someone who necessarily is just about farming up as much currency as possible. Like to me, that's a more exciting thing.
At one of the Exile cons, I forget which one it was, I got to meet PoE Dan, and I felt like a fanboy. So probably him. He's for anyone who's not familiar, he's just a really prolific and successful builds creator in the hardcore trade economy generally. He basically every build he makes is extremely well thought out, extremely powerful, and very well rounded. Exactly the kind of build that I like to try to make. I don't always succeed. Though honestly, I would say like probably for the average player, it would be somebody like Mathel, who can take seemingly any skill, unique combination, and turn it into a viable build, and just do that over and over and over again.
Big agree on Mathel. I love the like X item, X class, 3 question marks, try and get something to actually function. in the
and usually
endgame.
it works
I,
out.
I love that mindset. It's so good.
I think he's underrated as like a build maker. Just side note, like I think a lot of narratives, and I think the narrative space in PoE is really interesting, have been shifting towards very extreme ideas about like if it's not this, it's not valid. Like if you're not farming X way, you're not really valid. If you're not racing this way, your build isn't valid. If your skill is not rolling magma, it's not really valid. That kind of thing. And I think that like whenever I watch him play and watch him do stuff, it is like really, really eye opening. Kind of reminds me of a time in which we used to be kind of more human, more grounded.
When you used to have fun, John. When you used to have fun before you solved the game.
On like a very personal level, that is one of my evergreen frustrations from back even before I joined the company, from back when I was a content creator, is like it doesn't seem to matter the tier of content that gets put into the game. The expectations of what is minimum viability will just rise to meet that. So like ever since Uber bosses have been added to the game, for instance, I will often make a build that doesn't quite reach Uber boss viability and still be personally quite happy with that build because it accomplished what I wanted it to do. But it does sometimes feel like, particularly among entrenched players, there's a feeling that if the build doesn't, demolish every Uber boss in the game, that it's not valid enough, it's not good enough. And I would just encourage people to, cut yourself a little slack on that front. Like there are a lot of degrees of difficulty and challenge in this game. There's a lot of rabbit holes you can go down, and if you theory craft something that's cool and interesting, but it doesn't quite, kill Uber bosses in 12 seconds, it's probably fine. It's probably still cool. Like that could still be a really cool build. Have just tone back the expectations a little bit to allow yourself a little more room to explore weird, cool stuff.
Yeah, you get bullied, I mean, everyone's.
It's harder when you're in front of a camera with 1,000 viewers. Yes, not that my stream ever reached that level, but when you have a lot of people who are expecting you to consistently create, every build is reaching that same watermark, if not higher, I can understand that that's a little tougher. What's interesting though is we did add one bit of like super mega Uber content to the game that didn't end up becoming the watermark, which is Valdo maps.
But John
You
talks
see
about it all the
that.
time. That's why we actually
You
brought
see
it up
that.
because
The last
Has it
I
now
have
become
not
the watermark?
slept for the past 4 days. I have not slept more than 3 hours on any given night because I'm
You're really
trying to
gonna
make
know
a
about this
build to be able to run every single Valdo map agnostically that I can get set up roughly by day 3. And do it in a reasonable time. And it's just like last night I did not sleep pretty much. I just lay there like this, staring at my ceiling, reading the list of Valdo mods, not on my phone, but on my ceiling as it's appearing before my eyes over and over again. So you say that, Octavian, but I'm like, it's a nightmare, I mean, maybe I'm
Sure.
not having fun, but
It's cool that it's a thing you can aspirationally shoot for. That's great. But would you say that it's like every build guide that you see and that you put out, people are asking, is this Valdo viable? Because that hasn't been my experience looking through, the forums and Reddit and that sort of thing.
like for my content these days, people are just asking if it's 5 or more buttons, I think, to play. So they don't like that, And can I ask, who do you like watching when you do consume any PoE content?
I wouldn't say I consume much streamer content or YouTube videos. I think on League launch I will watch Quinn69 though, but I'm not watching him for expert gameplay. I'm watching him for other reasons.
Based. I actually think
It's
he's
a good comedy.
I'm often lurking in either Pock, his channel. He's like a somewhat smaller, like sort of hardcore creator, or Captain Lance. Sometimes I'll just be lurking there without notifying anyone, seeing what busted crafting methods he's cooking up.
They're both Pocket and Lance are much more like willing to delve into off meta really early and right away, right? And really trying to keep this caster thing afloat.
Yeah, I mean, if it involves Ignite, Pock will play it. So
I think the
Who do you
benchmarking
watch,
thing
John?
was pretty cool though.
Who's yours? Ben, John, you turn off your stream. You're laying in bed. Who do you tune into?
Is this Path of Exile only or?
Yes, Path of Exile only. I do not want to hear about any other habits on this podcast.
It's a shame because he doesn't really stream much anymore from my perspective. And I mean, he's got stuff coming up, but I think one of my favorite players might have been Steel Mage. At least one of my favorite streamers. I would say my favorite streamer of all time is, or at least the person I consider the best streamer of all time is actually Quinn as well. But Steel's stream, I missed it a lot. I thought he balanced a lot of things in there, in terms of like having a relatively casual, friendly narrative, being pretty inviting, talking in the way that a lot of, and I want to use this word carefully, just don't contextualize this poorly, but like PoE elites, I guess, kind of talk with too much of an elitist lens. I feel like he really didn't do that. But I think it ended up fostering a really interesting dynamic with his chat, and probably winning Gauntlet made him try less hard, you know? Maybe when I win, I'm gonna quit, you know, just be washed up. There was one other skill I was really interested about, that I kind of was thinking about asking, since we're kind of on big topic side, feeling really comfortable. General's Cry. It's like the skill that I think has gone probably under the radar for a long time. And I brought it back with like Textime a while back. I know Path of Someone used to play it back in the day with Blade Flurry and Abyssus and stuff. And these days I feel like it still has like really, really insane numbers. But the mechanical complexity of it is absurd. Every skill that I've tried to play on it kind of functions differently. I recently tried Static Strike, for instance, which allows you to have clones summon these static beams. The static beams are still there when the clones disappear, but then when new clones are resummoned, those beams will disappear. So the two questions I have kind of flowing from that is, one, like when you think about this kind of skill balance, is it balanced against the complexity and hidden mechanics of the skill, its power? And then two, are there ways in like, are there things that we just don't know about how these skills function? Are there like some skills that you think are much more powerful, but that we haven't really understood them yet as players and seen their potential?
Well, General's Cry is an interesting one because it's often creates a lot of like unintended or even buggy interactions. Like I think for a long while there, you had like the alternate Tectonic Slam gem, and it's like the General's Cry minions did not consume endurance charges, but they still benefited from all your endurance charges, making it very strong. So I wasn't actually aware of that Static Strike case. Sounds slightly buggy, to be honest, so maybe we should fix it at some point.
I was maybe going to league start that.
Oh. Oh no, we're definitely not changing it in time for tomorrow. Yeah, I think I played General's Cry once on like a shield crush build, and it was, yeah, I agree, it has a little bit of jank, which might justify some slightly higher numbers, but it was pretty fun.
Like the skill that had the most complexity that I ever worked with would have been Eye of Winter, right? Where like on Eye of Winter's return, I don't know if you guys ever saw that build come out, the Arcanist brand
Oh
thing.
yeah, I think that's like the only build that I know from you quite well. I thought that was like a very novel concept at the time. That was the one with the Arcanist brand return, but you needed to use Arcanist brand so that the Eye of Winter projectiles could actually come back in shotgun.
There was like this weird line that said, because Eye of Winter projectiles could always shotgun, but there was a line that said maximum or like less travel range. I forgot what it says on Arcanist brand. It's not found anywhere else in the game. And I think Lance had been testing with Nimbus that patch prior about like certain skills needed certain projectile speed thresholds. So we were under the assumption that a lot of projectiles couldn't return. And Eye of Winter might have been the case, but then once you put that in, it made it like a lot of projectiles more easy. I wonder about the other skills, you know, like that we're not knowing, that we're not understanding in terms of the greater complexity.
And also how much of it is deliberate design choice. Like, you know, we know that this is complicated, so we're going to make it slightly stronger or slightly different. And how much of it is just like, oh, you know, that skill was put in the game X amount of years ago, and if anyone tries to touch the code, it actually breaks Molten Strike, so we can't touch the code, you know?
Well, for Arcanist brand in particular, I imagine that line was put there just in order to limit the reach of the Arcanist brand and, you know, keep it from being quite as strong in terms of its ability. Like I'm sure when Arcanist brand was originally being designed, whoever was the designer was like, we want this to be strong, but we don't want this to be able to like off-screen stuff for you. So let's put a stat that lowers the maximum action distance of the projectile. You know, we don't necessarily use that stat elsewhere, but it does exist. It's often on monster abilities, so that monsters can't off-screen you with stuff as easily. Basically, every monster with a projectile skill has some amount of that stat, and it was very likely not to, you know, not considering the balance implications it might have with some niche interaction. It's the same thing with General's Cry. Like, General's Cry is one of those things that I personally really like. I've played like 3 or 4 General's Cry builds over the years, but it can be a little frustrating design-wise because it means every time we design a new skill that can interact with it, you have to test it against it, and you have to test that new skill against, you know, the Savior if it works with that. You have to test it against traps, mines, totems, Arcanist brand, triggering with the various different ways, and like, it's just another example. You know, it's similar to like something like Reliquarian, where we design ourselves something that we have to have maintenance and upkeep, but that's what makes the game cool. Like, you know, I say it's frustrating, but it's what makes the game cool, so it's worth it, definitely. Sorry, I went off on a bit of a tangent there.
I have another like kind of niche question around that as well. There was a bug in League of Legends. I don't know if you kept up to date with the game, Octavian, where Rumble on blue side would just do more damage for some reason than
yeah.
Rumble on red side,
Yeah,
and
I
it was
remember that.
just because of how League of Legends was coded. So for like genuinely since the inception of League of Legends, Rumble on blue side has just had a 5% higher win rate, and then Freak looked at the number, and like Freak was a caster, Andrew, and like a big community guy. Now he's on design, which is like really really cool for me. And it was like, okay, I know that this number does not make sense. It has nothing to do with match symmetry. I'm going to go in, I'm going to look at it, and then I'm going to fix it. And he said like tearing through that code was like a nightmare. Are there any niche bugs that you guys have come across, or like are there any experiences you've had with like legacy code and like how PoE as a game kind of was written versus how it is now that have like had funny stories like that internally? Because like stuff like that to me is just so hilarious.
So it's not player skill related, but I do have an example that pretty much fits this perfectly. So there was a bug that was around since before I joined QA, and that I kept getting reports for maybe once or twice a month when I was back in QA, and it really bothered me, which was the delve node that gives you, you know, the one that has like the little pillar that you break and it drops a fossil and there's a bunch of essence monsters around it. I forget the name of the fossil, but that pillar one. The delve node that gives you that essence from the pillar, or sorry, that fossil from the pillar was breaking. I think it's called an etheric essence, or etheric fossil, sorry. And sometimes you just weren't able to interact with it, and so you would not get your fossil, and that obviously sucks. And I couldn't. So when somebody does a bug report in game, we get what we call a repro of that area. So we get a cheat code that allows us to then go to exactly that area with all the stats that are applied to it. And I would do that, and it would just work. It would still just work like every time. It was fine. It wasn't broken, but you know, enough people were consistently reporting this that it clearly wasn't just player error or something. So eventually I realized that every time one of the essence monsters surrounding it was an Essence of Scorn. Essence of Scorn has this ability where it grabs you with a big hand and pulls you to it. That is stolen from the Dominus fight. It's a recolor of that. So Dominus has this ability where he'll pull you next to him with a big hand sometimes in his second phase, I believe. And what that skill was doing was looking for anything not on its team, grabbing it and pulling it to it. The pillar that drops the fossil is technically a chest, so it's not on the monster's team. So it could sometimes, if the player was standing at the wrong place at the wrong time, grab the chest and move it. And the code for that chest is so ancient, it's not looking for the chest, it's looking for the location that the chest is at. So if the chest moves at all, it doesn't work anymore. So what we did is we made the hand skill look specifically for, you know, things on the enemy team, not just things not on its team, so that neutral objects like chests don't get grabbed. But yeah, it was a bit of a rabbit hole.
That's crazy. There's a bug right now. I don't know if you have an answer for this. Earthquake of amplification with General's Cry. After 5.4 seconds from the point at which the instance is created, will disappear instead of resolving. We heard about this.
What do you mean by since the instance was created?
The earthquake instance. Like, not from the point at which you attack, but the point at which it hits the ground.
No, well, internally the word instance is used to like refer to an area. So
I was thinking damage instance, but like,
yeah, sure.
A skill. Let's say skill. After the initial animation has resolved, that would be the point.
Yeah, no, I haven't heard anything. Maybe someone can look into it after this, but
yeah,
it's one of those things where it's just like there's just so much complexity and permutations of interactions within the game at this point. We're really there's definitely not enough time for everyone in design and QA to test them all out. So community members will find them 2 years later since the gem was released.
Or what's like the area of the game that you guys like working on the most in terms of design for like the future leagues and stuff? Especially like I kind of see Path of Exile in two ways. One is as a loot game, like a looting game, and one is a character creation game. I'm sure there's lots of shades in between. And I think from those two lenses, there's lots of different sub aspects that like I kind of value the most, or that I am most excited about when, say, I read patch notes or when I see changes. What are the systems that you guys look at and like get most excited about when you're working on it, and why?
Personally, I'd probably say ascendancies, and I think that's just because I just like the idea of having very few but very punchy and transformative passives.
I think skill design for me, which is why we've had new skills the last two patches, because I've really pushed for that, and like I've said in some of these previous Q&As, I want to push for every skill to eventually have its own transfigured version or versions, partially just because I really like working on skills. It's very, very fun. Though the endgame boss this league is the first endgame boss that I've like designed, you know, start to finish, and I really enjoyed that process. Hopefully people like fighting him. So because that was a lot of fun.
Following up with the first one first, what is the Sensi do you think is best designed then? When you like, and like, what's the rationale behind that?
Well, I'm trying to discern between best design and my favorite. I think historically my favorite is probably Trickster, and I've always felt that Trickster has struck this nice medium of just being like, it feels like a nice balance of both offense, defense, and utility, all wrapped in one. It's usually had a lot of like varied choices which you could go for. I don't think I played it in a while though, so I can't actually speak to the current state of Trickster, but historically that's probably been my favorite ascendancy. So maybe by that token, I also consider it the best designed. Like, to be honest, I'd say best designed to me would be more from a flavor point of view, as opposed to necessarily like the stats it offers. I think bad designs on ascendancies tend to be things that are also like hyper niche. Like, we've never really liked Saboteur calling out traps and mines directly, because it feels like if you're a trap and mine build, well, you should be playing Saboteur. But if Saboteur's not very good, then no one plays Saboteur because half its nodes are related to traps and mines.
It's interesting because I think prior to you saying this, I had the opposite idea of what I thought you guys thought. Insofar as I thought PoE2's ascendancy design would be considered like better in the sense that a lot of things are much more unique, right? Like from ascendancy to ascendancy, they're very, very transformative. Whereas I thought PoE1 ascendancy design is more like it gives you baseline power or scaled power in different ways, but is more interactive with what's already there. So like I guess like between the tension of like heterogeneity and homogeneity and generic modifiers, it seems like prioritizing choice is actually what you're seeing as like good design as far as ascendancies, right?
Are you saying choice within an ascendancy or choice between ascendancies?
Once you choose the ascendancy, you're still granted further choice. As opposed to like I've chosen ascendancy, it gives me X skill.
Yeah, well, I definitely feel like, say I'm just playing Fireball, for example, then I want to, like, I think we internally had this test of like a good ascendancy. I think this was primarily when designing PoE 2, but we've also used it on PoE 1, where it's like, can you play this ascendancy on Fireball? Do I have enough nodes to take if I'm a Fireball build? And can I play this ascendancy on Flicker Strike? Is there enough nodes to play if I'm a Flicker Strike build? So if you can answer those two questions, then you probably have enough generic. It doesn't have to be super generic. It just needs to be like, it can be super weird, but you could still theoretically make a Fireball build around it. So yeah, having it be generic enough that you can do that is like probably one of our main goals.
That's really interesting, because if you like working on that, and if that's something that you guys discuss internally, how do the Bloodline ascendancies come in? Because I feel like what Bloodline was for me is like, okay, I have like a couple of hyper niche things, and then, you know, I have all the other ascendancies where I can get my generic power, you know, and I think that that design choice was really like actually a beautiful solution to a rather complex problem, to be honest, because I was always like, give me Forbidden Flesh Flame for like Frasier, or give me the access to one Frasier one, and then you kind of came up with this hybrid middle ground, and it was pretty cool to me.
Yeah, Bloodlines are certainly designed differently to regular Ascendancy nodes. They sort of are a bit more niche, and they can be niche. The reason for that is we don't really want you to be saying, oh, I'm an occultist. I take one node on the occultist, and then I take 3 nodes on the Bloodline. And then are you really an occultist at that point if you're only taking one node on the occultist? It was sort of meant to just give you like enumerate other options that are often very niche but can like pair with your base ascendancy.
The other danger, if you go the route of making bloodlines less niche and more broad, is you water down the identity of the other ascendancies in the game, where, like, you know, if there's this really powerful bloodline that's also really broad, half the builds in the game are taking that bloodline, and suddenly it doesn't really matter, like, you know, oh, I'm a slayer versus a champion versus a trickster or whatever. Most of my power from the ascendancy points is actually coming from these 4 points I put in my bloodline that everyone else is taking. So I think niche is important for bloodlines. They're sort of a capstone niche, you know, direction you take your build in the end game.
But then why is Slayer the worst ascendancy design then?
That feels like a very loaded question.
What I would
Someone
say
asked me to
about
ask
Slayer, I feel like Slayer historically has got fewer changes than a lot of the other ascendancies. Like, I feel like it still has a lot of the same nodes that it probably did like 10 years ago at this point. If ascendancies have been out 10
the
years.
Stuff is relative. God, it feels recent to me. That's still probably years ago.
I think that's been since Legion League.
Yeah, that's probably a while ago at this point.
Yeah, Overwhelm has been. Yeah, I think Masterful also got a rework, right? The Frenzy Charge Endurance thing. That came in later as well. So in terms of, I guess, like the same thing to you, Octavian, in terms of skill design, Is there something that you look at and think like, this is the most interesting skill to me in the world?
Most interesting
Yeah.
is going to be an answer that I don't think a lot of people will resonate with or expect, which is
Sick.
I honestly think what's it called? Stormbind, the one where you place the rectangles on the ground and then you
Yes.
charge them and they explode. I honestly think that skill is an incredibly cool design for a different video game. Like it doesn't, and this was designed before I joined the company. This is not me trying to toot my own horn. You know, this was 2019, 2018 that it was designed, I believe. Like it's a really cool, interesting design that like takes stats and leverages them in different ways than any other build would, where like your cast speed sort of becomes your AoE in a way, and your mana cost sort of becomes your cast speed. And it's really cool. And then, you know, it's that meme of like thinking about Stormbind versus playing Stormbind, where like in another slower paced, more methodical ARPG than what Path of Exile 1 is, it would have been perfect. But yeah, it's probably the most interesting. Sure.
That sounds super leading.
What's that?
That sounds really leading in a more methodical ARPG, similar to Path of Exile 1, but not PoE 1. Yeah, it could fit there. For sure.
I didn't mean it that way. Yeah, sure. I could see where you would interpret that. No, I don't. I don't work on PoE 2. I have no idea if Stormbind is going to PoE 2. Probably not. But I've kind of always held that opinion that it's this really, really cool skill that would do extremely well in some other video game that isn't PoE 1. As far as like some of my favorite skills in PoE 1 that, you know, I wouldn't put in that bucket of not really being too viable for the game is, I don't know. It's very basic, but I really like Shield Crush. I think that's mostly down to the audio, though. Like the sound team did an excellent job on that skill. It sounds great. It's really satisfying to use. I also really like Cremation. I've come to realize over the years that some of the skill design that I like is things where you place something in an area and then it does something for a while. Like I like, you know, Flamethrower Trap, Seismic Trap, Cremation. You know, my other league start option in this league was Siphoning Trap of Pain, the alternate one, because it's that same sort of design. Yeah, I don't know. I could talk about this for hours. I love skill design in general and so many of the skills in the game.
Maybe one day, maybe in like a year, I'll come over and we'll have a conversation about that, because I would just listening to why skills exist and what like you can glean from them, I think is a really, really different perspective than what I take. I think it's really easy for me to get too distilled down to like this does X number in this content and this does X number against other content, and kind of have that be too prolific in terms of like how it's affecting like my build creation.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the time, whether or not I end up going with a given skill design is, you know, it's a mix of like talking to Andrew and other designers and seeing if they think it's cool, but then also pitching it to like somebody on the art team or somebody in environment art or somebody in audio. And, you know, that's not to say these people don't play the game at all, but they're not at the, you know, sort of analytical level necessarily. And if the base concept is enough to be like, oh, that's cool, I would play that, then that's the acid test, I guess is the term. That's an acid test for whether or not I think we should go ahead with that design.
I was just gonna say that I think the skill that got me into like thinking Path of Exile is a like insanely cool game is Ray Spectre. Like when I learned about Ray Spectre, I'm like, what? You can just take like almost any monster in the game and it works with all your support gems and it's a viable build. It was like that just blew my mind when I learned about that skill.
I can love Detonate Dead. Yeah.
I was going to say that, like, how does skill design work for you when it is 1 button versus 2 button? Because like I think that simplicity skill design wise is like always a nice thing. I love that you mentioned Shield Crush. I think it is a really good new skill. But then there's like things like Detonate Dead, you know, things like, you know, Essence Drain, Contagion. Like how do you think 2 button versus 1 button skill design works, and how do you reconcile that as a designer?
I think it all comes down to like whether or not you have a good core concept. I feel like I'm not communicating this well. I don't mean to be dodging the question if it sounds like I am, but it's like usually my method of skill design is I come up with some strange weird thing or core foundational concept of what the skill should do, and then it's about building the architecture of the skill around that. So like for Holy Hammers, for instance, it's like, what if you had a slam and then that slam repeated if it hit something, and that was the foundation for that skill, and then, you know, you get that into game, you iterate with like placeholder visuals, and then you see what feels good in actual gameplay, and you don't get too attached to the entirety of a design right at the start, because so much of it may need to change in the course of implementation. I don't know. I don't feel strongly that like 1 button versus 2 button versus 3 button is like, there's nothing correct there. It's good to have variety. Like, you know, I actually, these skills this time around tried to put an emphasis on making things a little simpler, because I feel like for some of the wand skills, I probably overcomplicated a few of those. You know, like Divine Blast is you put a thing on the ground and it explodes. And that's kind of an experiment in like, you know, how simple can you make a skill while still having it be compelling and interesting? And I think Divine Blast did pretty well on that front.
That skill is extremely interesting, because I think it's the first time we have an attack in the game that's not melee or a projectile.
In PoE 1, at least. I think there are examples of that in PoE 2, but yeah, it is just attack.
And how do you feel about the catch-all ability? Because I know what people are looking for most of the time when they do it is like, this ability should be able to clear, but then also should be able to boss. Whereas some of my favorite builds of all time is like, this is purely a mapping ability. You know, Exsanguinate is like one of those things where it's like, I would really not want to boss on that, but to map on it feels so extremely good. So how do you reconcile that during the design process of, you know, oh, I want to create this thing, it's probably not going to be good for X, but I think it is going to excel at Y. Is that a better ability or worse ability skill design wise?
I would personally rather lean into things that differentiate skills rather than homogenize things. Yeah. I would personally rather be, you know, and it's not necessarily a box that I'm checking on every skill that I'm working on, but it's like, if a skill feels like from a mechanical perspective it's going to be much better for clear, then leaning into that and making it more of its identity is probably correct over trying to like smooth out and make every skill equally good for every task. That doesn't seem healthy to me, no.
Yeah, I would say that PoE 1 sort of has a little bit more of an issue with this compared to PoE 2, just because it's hard to fit multiple 6 links into your build. So the fact that your support gems contribute so much of the power to your main skill means that often if you want to use multiple skills, like a single target and a clear skill at endgame, you need to be giving up either a lot of utility skills to do so, or having like some sort of pseudo 6 link in your like helm or glove slot.
Technically easier this patch because the imbued support things support everything in the link group they're in. So if you have 2 active skills and one of them has an imbued link, then you have 2 6 links.
Small clarifying question. So wand skill complexity you mentioned, would you consider it a bug if, say, there was a wand skill that does damage and applies some sort of debuff, and then you have to proc that debuff with a different skill, but if you use secondary damage to proc that debuff, you can turn that into a 1-button build?
So you mean something like Somatic Shell plus Living Lightning?
No, Impale.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, the Impale isn't sourced from the skill in that way, right? Like that is working. I wouldn't call that a bug. Because, and this is something where Mark 1 may, you know, contradict me in a forum post, so I don't want to get too much into super specifics, because this is definitely his domain. You know, the specifics of damage being sourced from certain places and when the damage packet is occurring, and that ordering is, you know, hyper complex. I have a broad understanding of it. I do not have the in-depth understanding that Mark 1 has. But from my broad understanding of it, I don't think that's a bug. That seems just correct from the way that the damage packets are occurring, and like, because if Impale wasn't considered as something separate, then it would scale again, right? And that would lead to double dipping or whatever you want to call it, and that would be a problem.
Yeah, well, I guess the bug is the fact that that skill gem does no damage. I can understand. Okay.
Sure. Yeah, Somatic Shell is actually probably the one that is at the top of my list for wanting to look at it again, going into like 329 or 330 or whenever there is time, because I think there was a core cool concept there that didn't land.
I think it's close. I think it definitely runs a risk because of that, of like having an infinite loop interaction, because of like things because like it chains off and then it chains off the next one, and I can actually go again and again. So like when I entered a map with it, it was slow because of projectile speed stuff, but
it's the kind of skill where I feel like there is some small to medium tweak that could be made with the functionality that would massively improve it. And I just need to spend some time, you know, maybe with a programmer trying to figure out what my options are, and then make that change. It's also the one that came in the hottest, so to speak, in 328. Like it was being worked on in the last week leading up to release. So like, yeah, it's one that I want to revisit for sure. I can't promise exactly when, but I want to.
I think we've kept you guys here for a pretty long time. Is there any questions you have for us, or is there anything you guys want to say to the community? Probably last interview before the patch hits in a couple of days. So how are you guys going?
I don't know. What builds are you guys playing?
I'm going to go champion or a bot, probably, and I'll probably play in like a 2 or 3 man party, and then I'll probably level as either slams, or if there's a cool strike skill that I can find, I'll try and do that. So that's probably where I'll end up.
How many hours of work do you have available left before the last balance change can happen? Before I answer that.
Well, who's to say we can't do them post-release? No, we pretty much always try to avoid post-release balance changes unless there's like extreme circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, if you make something that can
still
crash
time.
servers, we might have a different conversation here.
I mean, I think slams need to be nerfed, but I think going Grey Wind, topside assassin, poison, with the new calculator risk, there was some interesting stuff there. That calculator risk being the
I would
saboteur.
love to see you make that work.
It looks like the most promising setup I had after, like, even in comparing to War of Attrition numbers on Gladiator, even comparing to other things. I think that's looking okay for Valdez so far. So hopefully in a couple days, yeah.
Don't have any specific questions for you guys, I guess. I more so just want to wish everybody a good league start. And, you know, there's 4 months of it. So I know there's a lot of pressure around league start to do super well, but like for most players, I feel you cut yourself a little slack. Just enjoy it, chill, have a good time.
I guess personally, I'm going to speak for myself. I know we both appreciate having you on here, both like immensely, but I've got to hear so many things that I've never thought I'd be able to hear in terms of like information, in terms of understanding why things happen, in terms of like how your mindset is, and in terms of understanding why the game has developed the way that it is. And I think the past like couple of years has been so different for PoE and really exciting in a lot of ways. And a lot of, I think, my concerns about like, oh yeah, like deep scaling and stuff in terms of like stacking, it feels like everything's on the radar. And yeah, I just appreciate this a lot. Thank you guys so much for making this time, man. Appreciate that.
Thank you so much, guys.